Hi, welcome back to Worldviews in Church History. I'm your host, Kent Powderly. Let's begin with a word of prayer. Father, thank you for the opportunity to do this. And Lord, I pray that you'd anoint the teaching, anoint the listening, and help this to bring glory to you. In Jesus' name, amen. Well, we're at week 22. Enlightenment ideologies, the prototype of modern political revolution, Romanticism, the initial Christian responses, Reason, Revolution, and Renewal, Part 3, or as I like to call it, the weird section. We left off last time with the rise of a new materialistic ideology in the wake of the religious wars. We saw how Voltaire was saying things like, Christianity is the most ridiculous, most absurd, and bloody religion that has ever infected the world. Yeah, right. Hobbes, Voltaire, and his followers effectively retooled the worldview of Epicurus we started with, and this assumed by faith that God did not interact with nature or humanity in the real world of materialism. Now, the Enlightenment thinkers hoped that science would one day discover the apparent complexity in design in nature would prove to be in reality very simple underneath it all. So they wanted an underlying, very simple nature that would be able to demonstrate a materialistic first cause reality. Yeah, good luck with that, boys. But they thought they could do it in the 1700s. They thought it was doable. But their initial obstacle, however, surprisingly enough, was that many of the early scientists for the last 100 years, prior to that, were also men of faith. Galileo, though he was arrogant, believed in God, he had faith. Johannes Kepler, Christian. Isaac Newton, Christian, had some theological issues, but believed in God and God created. And Robert Boyle, all of these guys believed that miracles happened and that miracles were an important part of the New Testament faith, and they all claimed to believe in that, and probably did. But rather than Aristotle's dictum, remember way back in week 1, we talked about Aristotle's dictum. Well, it's any text that claims to tell a history, one has to give the benefit of the doubt to the text and not to the ideology of the critic or the interpreter of the text. And Voltaire swapped that around. He basically pioneered the idea that history has to be the slave of ideology. And that, of course, has eaten up the academic world today. Not because it really makes any sense, but, well, you're going to see why. Now, to recap where we have come from. What is materialism? Materialism is a form of philosophical monism. Now, you don't have to remember monism. All that means is everything is basically made of one thing. In this case, it's matter. Other forms of monism, use other things. At any rate, materialism is the idea that only matter is real. Everything else is an outworking of some sort of material process, be it brain chemicals, environment, whatever. Even mental phenomenon, consciousness, and spirituality. That is materialism. It's the position that matter is the only thing that exists and all things can be reduced to matter. Whenever you see materialism, there is another word that's going to come right along with it, and it's called reductionism. And you can see it, reduced. Everything is reduced to matter. But one of the most basic rules of analysis is that the consistent appearance of two phenomena together does not logically mean that one had to have caused the other. It is equally possible that the two phenomena could be both caused by some other third source that is either not present or not seen, or that they each arrive separately from a different location to the place where they're being observed, having two similar causes. So those are also equally rational explanations for when you see two things all the time popping up in the same place. In this case, the presence of brain chemistry and its material mechanics does not mean that one caused the presence of brain chemistry and with the human spirit and mind and its choices does not mean that one caused the other. Rather, a third cause can logically exist for both matter and mind, and that of course would be God. So nobody ever proved that material brain chemicals cause the illusion of mind and spirit. That is an assumption. It is a very popular and well-known assumption today. A more logical assumption would be that brain chemistry and the spirit and the mind isn't the same as the brain, okay? The mind is who we are. More logical assumption would be that they're two different parts of a working system, much like computer hardware and software works together. This comparison, of course, was not yet possible at the time period we're talking about. However, the idea of a working system that involved information, that was possible. That was possible, not to the degree that we have today. But you could still infer that the presence of both matter in the brain, chemistry, and the mind and spirit are two different things that are working synergistically, working together. So that was possible. Materialism not only faced initial resistance from science, men of science were often the most aware of science's limits. They were not so quick to deny the other ways of knowing, the legal historic method, for example, and divine revelation. The fact that you had most of your big name scientists of the 1600s and into the 1700s saying, no, materialism doesn't explain things very well, and they're limiting science to observing material processes in nature, the created world, which is where science ought to be limited to. So they're not trying to make a holistic worldview out of science. These original scientists are, but what guys like Voltaire want is for them to do just that. Now, the cosmology of Genesis. Remember, cosmology, that's the explanation of why things are the way they are, how things are the way they are. Well, the cosmology of Genesis explained the horrors of evil as not being a part of the original creation, but of the fall and its subsequent curse. Genesis 3, Romans 8, 19 through 26. Retreating into agnosticism, which was the logical direction that materialism is going to push things, is a weak philosophical foundation. A comprehensive worldview cannot answer the big questions of origins and meaning by a shoulder-shrugging, we don't know. Now, deism, remember the idea that, well, there was a God originally who created everything and then left it all to run on automatic pilot? Well, that only pushed the origins question back into an unknowable prehistory. So that really didn't provide any satisfying answers. The Enlightenment thinkers needed more than alternate explanations for everything. They needed better ones. Their problem was, and actually still is, because they never really found this, they just think they did. Their problem was that they had to explain by totally naturalistic, time plus chance, non-supernatural means why anything existed at all. So the big problem of evidence, the big thing that they had to overcome was how to explain that there is anything at all. The burden of proof is really on them and still is, but we act like it's on us. How'd that happen? Well, science had already begun to address what became known as the law of conservation of matter and energy, enough to know that causes have more usable energy and in complexity than their effects. We covered that a little last time. Since all nature is self-evidently a system of effects, it demands a cause of greater energy potential and complexity than itself. Nature thus logically requires a supernatural cause. Now, introducing an entirely new cosmology, which is what Thomas Hobbes and later on Voltaire and others were hoping to do, a new explanation for everything required a huge amount of creative redefinition of existing knowledge. This not only required a new materialistic explanation of origins, it redefined humanity and all things human, morality, society, psychology, history, and much, much more. Take morality, for example. Now, the general idea of what was right and what was wrong did not change at this point, at least not on a large scale, for quite some time, and wouldn't for quite some time. When I say redefinition, we're talking about redefining the idea of what morality is. That's what changed. Morality before had been seen as an echo of God's righteousness in man. Now it was a mere product of human culture, subject to experiment and change. And we saw that Hobbes was the father of modern thought. He was the first one to put forth this idea that we could have a materialistic reality. And he was the first one to float the idea that human consciousness was merely a product of brain chemistry. Now, these ideas were further developed by Scotch philosopher David Hume, and he was the father of empiricism. Empiricism is the idea that we can only truly know that which we experience directly by our senses. I can't know anything unless I'm personally there to observe it. And there is an empirical aspect to science, but as a holistic worldview, we're going to see that empiricism falls way short. David Hume wrote, "The mind itself, far from being an independent power, is simply a bundle of perceptions without unity or cohesive quality." Really? Now, Hume applied the principle of reductionism to the study of the human condition. Now, reductionism is the process of reducing quantities to a manageable size. In atomic physics and in electrical theory and electronic theory, you have to use things like Ohm's law and stuff. You have to be able to reduce the numbers. You're talking about billions upon billions of atoms. You have to be able to reduce these numbers to workable sizes in order to get our minds around them. That would be a legitimate use of reductionism. Hume, on the other hand, took this and decided, well, we can apply this same principle not just to studying chemistry, but to studying the human condition. Really? Let's see what this produces. Ideologically reducing humanity to something less than what it really is, however, is going to distort our understanding of the human condition. You see, the difference is reductionism as a tool is a perfectly legitimate tool for chemistry and physics, okay? But if you try to apply it to the human condition, you're going to end up reducing humanity into something less than what it really is. You see, with the chemistry, yeah, you're reducing the numbers, but you haven't changed functionally what the chemicals are or the processes are or anything like that. To do that to the human condition, you have to functionally change the subject that you are studying. But that didn't occur to him. And now this is very important here, because I simply don't get why people listen to a guy who posed for a portrait wearing his mom's shower cap as a fashion statement. Now, maybe that's just me, but take it up with Mr. Hume. He proposed something called natural religion. And he wrote a paper called A Treatise on Human Nature, in which he said, our ideas reach no farther than our experience, and we can thus have no conception of divine attributes. In other words, a priori, before any evidence is even looked at, we have just eliminated the possibility of God actually telling his creation something about himself. We're just going to eliminate that right off the top of the bat. Yeah. So you see, evidence didn't prove that. The starting assumptions eliminated it before you could even look at the evidence. So anyway, Hume. The life of man is of no greater importance to the universe than that of an oyster. Now here we're going to see where this whole reductionism doesn't really work when you apply it to humanity. In the Christian worldview, because of the fall and the curse in Genesis chapter 3, we look at nature and see the indifference of the natural world, which basically will kill men just as easily as it kills oysters in a natural disaster. We see that as a product of the fall or the curse. But deism, which is what Hume and Voltaire embraced, denied the fall because the only knowledge of it comes to us through the Bible. And that would mean that God would have had to have communicated. And since we're eliminating all of that a priori, or before we even look at the evidence, we're eliminating that as a possibility, well, suddenly you've got a broken idea about God. You don't have any way of processing disaster. No moral way. Without divine revelation, the logical inference is that nature, which appears to be very much indifferent to human suffering, is a reflection of an indifferent God. See, unless you have God telling us there's a reason why it's this way, it's not because I'm indifferent, it's because there's sin. I mean, we might not like the reason, but at least there's a reason. But no, if you eliminate divine communication to man right off the bat, before you look at the evidence, the only rational conclusion you can draw to is that God is indifferent. Deism removed the foundation for confidence that God was even good in a way that a normal person can recognize as good. Another natural conclusion of having no unique human dignity, at a time when the abolition of slavery was starting to win the heart of Britain, Hume characterized the intelligence of black people thusly. He wrote in a paper called Of National Characters, and basically what this is it's a list of stereotypes of different ethnic groups, thinking that he's getting to the core of something here. Hume characterized black people thusly. He says, they talk of one Negro as a man of parts and learning. That was a Scottish, parts and learning. That was a Scottish expression for, he had all his stuff in one sock. But 'tis likely he is admired for very slender accomplishments, like a parrot who speaks a few words plainly. So, yeah, he's got a real good handle on human dignity there. Well, black people, yeah, even when they sound smart, they're just sort of like parrots, you know. No. Now, I'm not just judging Hume by today's standards. Hume was confronted in his own day by the moral philosopher James Beatty, who systematically wrote against Hume's views on humanity. Now, Hume wasn't a dummy. I make it sound, he must sound pretty dumb. He's making some pretty dumb assumptions, but he's not a dummy. And that, of course, only means that he's more accountable. He was writing also at a time when a black man by the name of Joseph Knight was in the process of winning his freedom in a Scottish court, and that this case would destroy slavery in Scotland. This is about a generation before things started saying goodbye to slavery in Britain as a whole. But in Scotland, slavery was illegal before it was in all of Britain. So another kudos there to Pastor Robert in his book on Scotland there. The Wesleyan revivals were also in full swing, and we're going to talk about those next week. And that William Wilberforce was fighting in Parliament to outlaw both the slave trade and slavery, all beginning and just after Hume's day. So these were things that were being leveled against Hume by his peers, people who lived in that time period. He wasn't this way because he couldn't know any other thing. He was this way because he was deliberately making a set of assumptions that he absolutely could not prove. Now, the logical progression of Hume's materialistic view of humanity resonated with the burgeoning Industrial Revolution. If man was just a bundle of chemical reactions with no unique dignity, then why not use them as a resource? Now, it isn't like people got around and thought about this, hey, yeah, let's do. No, it's as this view of humanity became more and more part of the public discussion in academics and in education, this idea began to kind of latch on and bring forth its ugly logical consequences. Now, Hume proposed trying to find the best moral system by experimenting on orphans. Some were given love and attention, while others were ignored and left to themselves. Really? Who do you think is going to do better, David? Brutal labor practices were the logical result. Children forced into hazardous factory jobs for 16 hours a day. Now, do these kids, this photo was taken a little later, it was like in the 1840s or thereabouts. Does this look like a terribly safe thing to have your kids be doing without shoes? This also reinforced the acceptance of slavery as a legitimate institution. Of course, fortunately, now you have these two streams of thought. You have now, in Britain, you have the Wesleyan revivals, which we're going to talk about, beginning to reaffirm and shore up the idea of human dignity, but you had materialistic rationalism breaking it down. And this is all happening at the same time. Industry and capitalism by themselves did not and do not demand a loss of human dignity. The faith assumptions of materialistic rationalism push things in that direction regardless of what area of reality they are addressing. If materialistic rationalism gains a foothold in how industry and capitalism is done, then it will push industry and capitalism in an abusive direction. And that's largely what happened. It was this ideological shift away from a Judeo-Christian view of humanity to that of materialistic rationalism that created the problem. And now we're going to see over the next few weeks how people are going to try to solve the problem caused by materialistic rationalism by more materialistic rationalism. sort of like Pharaoh's magicians there. See, we can turn water into blood too, Now, Enlightenment thinker, one of Voltaire's students was a man named Jean-Jacques Rousseau. And he began to feel very uncomfortable with the logical consequences of both his and his mentor's materialism. Now, he was Voltaire's student, and he was the father of a philosophical school of thought known as Romanticism. But don't think of him as a romantic guy. Yes, I know, he has those dreamy eyes, ladies. No, he doesn't. He looks a bit like a twit. But he's not a romantic guy. He sends the 5 illegitimate children of his by his several of his mistresses all off to orphanages. Romanticism is a feelings-based worldview that led to a form of liberty without personal responsibility. So, with rationalism basically reducing man to a machine, the Romanticist says, no, I'm more than just a machine. And so, he's making just a leap and a bellow and a huff and trying to find meaning in feelings, trying to discover truth by feeling that is beyond words. That's their kind of words. I mean, they used words like that. Now, Rousseau grew depressed by the dehumanization of man under materialistic rationalism and things like Voltaire's materialism and Hume's empiricism, and understandably so. His problem was, though, is he believed that man was basically good, not fallen. So man is not a sinner. He's basically good in Rousseau's mind and the mind of the Romantics. Human evil was the result of Christian and industrial society. So a combination of Christendom and then the new rising industrial society where with all the industrial abuses that are popping up very quickly because industrialists are gobbling up the Enlightenment. Human evil is the result of foreign elements, shall we say. Now, Rousseau wrote a book called The Social Contract in 1762. It was the blueprint for the French Revolution, which would come just a few years after he dies. And he writes, if man is good by nature, as I believe I have shown him to be, it follows that he stays that way as long as nothing foreign to him corrupts him. Now, this led to the ideal of the noble savage. And you can find this ideal in 19th century literature and especially in the post-impressionist, the impressionist, post-impressionist art of the late 19th century, about 100 years later. In fact, the artist Paul Gauguin was just a real doctrinaire disciple of Rousseau. And he went to Fiji to try to find the romantic noble savage. The Fijians were very friendly people, and so he had this fantasy basically of going there and finding all these topless women, because the Fijian women did go topless, and finding that noble savage. Well, it also led to a free sex lifestyle called the Bohemian Ideal. And this was espoused by the poet Percy Bysshe Shelley, also known as Lord Byron. And he was the husband of Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley, who wrote the novel Frankenstein, a modern-day Prometheus. So, but notice the irrational utopianism of this conclusion in Rousseau's Social Contract. He wrote, "In order that the social compact may not be an empty formula, it tacitly includes the undertaking, which alone can give force to the rest, that whoever refuses to obey the general will of the people shall be compelled to do so by the whole body. This means nothing less than that he will be forced to be free." Well, there's nothing dystopian about that statement. One tyranny, in other words, is about to be replaced by another, much more deceptive one. One akin to the statement, "Freedom is slavery," as it's found in 1984 by George Orwell. This is the painting by Paul Gauguin, Whence, What, Whither. It was painted about 100 years after Rousseau. And he painted this in despair after a suicide attempt because he failed to find Rousseau's fantasy of the noble savage in Fiji. He went there and everything looked wonderful, idyllic, until he found out that among the Fijians you had the same vices, the same power plays, the same abuses as you find everywhere else. It was just, on a more primitive level, but it's all there. In other words, people weren't more noble when they were more primitive, just because they were more primitive. That didn't work out for him too well. Well, this is a painting. This is a weird little painting. And it kind of brings to life a vision of another romanticist, Friedrich von Schiller. And he one of his most famous lines is, "All creatures drink with joy from nature's breasts." But this is not where Rousseau's Romanticism really leads either. One place where it does lead, not the only place, but one place, was because of its emphasis on nature and freedom from restraint, unleashing the human passion to find meaning and truth beyond words, also led to the philosophy of the Marquis de Sade. In nature, the strong prey on the weak. And since this is so, de Sade held that it was only natural for the strong to prey sexually on women or on weaker men. And we get the word sadomasochism from his name. He actually had a kind of a little philosophy behind it all, really more of an anti-philosophy, but it logically flowed from the idea of trying to find truth in passion without restraint. And de Sade wrote a couple of novels. The first one is Justine, and the subtitle of it is Virtue Amply Punished. And Justine is about this girl, teenage girl, who's trying to be all virtuous, and she keeps getting into all of these situations and ending up in these horrible pornographic type situations. It's written by the Marquis de Sade. What do you expect? And then there's another novel called Juliet, about her sister, she's just this total whore of a woman who keeps getting rewarded for all of her, I guess she gets paid well or something. But there was a movie that came out in the 1960s called De Sade, and the motto was, "Do whatever your desire dictates. Imagination is the only truth." So, yeah. Aside from this, why might Rousseau grow depressed at Voltaire's rationalism and Hume's empiricism? He's got enough on his plate to grow depressed about there, wouldn't you say? But it was because he partly saw where things were leading. If human value is not found in the dignity of us being made in the image of God, then it must have some other basis for dignity. Materialism leaves only one, a utilitarian value. Now this is the father of a formal ideology known as utilitarianism. His name is Jeremy Bentham. He's a legal scholar in Britain. And he basically said, it was at a time when in London they were getting very concerned about overpopulation and things like that. And Bentham said that human value is based on usefulness. Is the person useful or not? And, he looked at all human traditions and all of this stuff, and he just found really all of this is very wasteful. He particularly had a thing about, funerary rites, burying the dead and, having all. He considered it extremely wasteful. He said, no, we should render the bodies and make soap from them. Do something useful. Instead of pretending about all of this fairyland of spirits and whatnot. That's my Bentham Brit accent. I have other Brit accents for people who are better than Bentham, so sorry. So anyway, you got this utilitarianism now. And, okay, but get this. Bentham decides that his own body is probably better, it will better serve utility, not as being rendered into soap, but as a model and a monument for his brave new world of utilitarianism. He willed, in his will to the University College at London, that they would taxidermize his body and sit him up in the University College as a monument to utilitarianism, because he really thought this was the way of the future, this is where things are going. Unfortunately, they did exactly. If he's looking a little peaked there's a good reason. It's because he's dead, okay? He's sitting there, he's dead. But the taxidermist didn't do so great a job on the head. And so it started getting all rasty. And so they had to lop off his head. But because the way it was worded in the will, the body had to be there on display, they plopped a wax head on the body and they put the rasty one down between his feet. And this is the freak show that materialism leads to, people. So the ideology that human value should be gauged by its utility to society and economics. In a materialistic world, there's no God-ordained worth for humanity. Utility or usefulness of individuals and groups becomes the default value. But usefulness as measured by whom and for whom? Always a good question to ask that if you're thinking of doing anything utilitarian. Now, Voltaire, jumping back a little, had spent time in exile in England as a young man during the early 1700s. And he was there during the bloodless, glorious revolution when William and Mary were brought in and put on the throne, and Britain became a constitutional monarchy. And Voltaire had been so impressed by what he saw there that he figures that we can do the same thing with the corrupt French monarchy. But his expectation was not terribly realistic, because he was going to do it because he was convinced he could do it better by starting from materialistic faith assumptions and Enlightenment-based faith assumptions. And unlike the Reformation-based worldview of the Glorious Revolution, the French one followed Voltaire's materialistic rationalism and Rousseau's Romanticism. It did not see humanity as fallen, and as a result, it did not think to include a balance of powers. The power of the people became the power of the mob, and a near instant bloodbath. Rousseau's passionate Romanticism gave no answers. It only served to illustrate how fanaticism is a human problem and not simply a religious one. Rousseau's ideological secularism led to the French Revolution's reign of terror. Maximilien Robespierre was a student of Rousseau and carried his mentor's assumptions about humanity out to their logical conclusions. Robespierre was fiercely against the death penalty. He was an altruist, that is, he was very big on helping the poor. He was an advocate of pure democracy. He was also the source of France's national motto, liberty, equality, and fraternity. Now, he sought rigid application of Rousseau's social contract. His fellow revolutionaries referred to him as the incorruptible. He was very doctrinaire Rousseau, and you couldn't steer this guy off course. And so he was called the incorruptible. But when it came to the trial of Louis XVI, once they overthrew him, Robespierre called for the king's execution. And he led the radical side of the French Revolution, which soon purged out the moderates. In 1793, Robespierre was elected to lead the Committee of Public Safety, which was effectively the revolution's executive power. But remember, there's not a great deal of balance of power here involved. This was not a clean and bloodless thing at all. Robespierre reacted to the sharp rise of crime and national disorder, threats of foreign attack, and that of counter-revolution by instituting what came to be known as the Terror. 17,000 people within a matter of 10 months were formally executed, and an additional 25,000 were summarily executed without trial based on mere accusation. In other words, oh, I saw him with the royals. He was one of the servants of the royals. This is a cartload of people being taken off where they can be forced to be free, along with their wives and children who are being forced to be free under the hooves of the revolutionary soldiers there. Oh, look, there was a young lady who was forced to be free by having her head cut off, and the people are dancing in the streets. She was had been a royal, not a royal necessarily, but of the upper crust. Very, very quickly, within less than a year, the French Revolution became a bloodbath. And they began to lose their popular support. Maximilien Robespierre wrote the following: "Terror is only justice, prompt, severe, and inflexible. It is then an emanation of virtue. It is less a distinct principle than a natural consequence of the general principle of democracy applied to the most pressing wants of the country." You want to know why pure democracy becomes dictatorship? That's why, right there. That's why we live in a democratic republic. We don't live in a democracy. Democracy leads to this. I'm sorry, it's true. Without Republican safeguards, democracy leads to that. Promising them liberty, they themselves are slaves of corruption. 2 Peter 2:19a. Now, Robespierre also turned his guillotines on the Catholic Church, major landowner, a purveyor of that oppressive fiction called God. The Cathedral of Notre Dame was seized and renamed the Temple of Reason, and an actress playing the goddess of reason was enthroned there. The goddess of liberty and reason, she was kind of interchangeable between liberty and reason. That painting is still in the one of the French government buildings. It's the original conception of Lady Liberty before the sanitized one we got. Now, the result of the French Revolution's chaos and terror led to the imperial dictatorship of Napoleon Bonaparte. Instability is always a precursor to dictatorship. It will be so even in today's let's buy up the town and knock it all down and build a brand new world of our own approach to revolution. There's no guarantee, however, that the buyers and the knockers will get to be the rebuilders. Never is. Repeatedly, history shows that they end up kicking the social foundations out from underneath themselves as well as from everybody else. Marxism would later model itself on the French Revolution because it shared its basic faith assumption of materialistic rationalism. But that assumption does not fit the realities of the human condition, and thus can give us no coherent answers in the end, no matter how rationally it builds on its flawed assumptions. The people grew weary of the French Revolution's societal chaos and terror, and Napoleon had originally backed Robespierre because of his supposed incorruptibility. Of course, this was when Napoleon was only about 22, so we'll give him a little bit of slack there for being young. But he was also an army officer, and he was a pragmatic man, and eventually he saw things where things were leading. And as he had rejected the monarchy, Napoleon soon grew even more disgusted with the radical revolutionary mobs that had been enabled by Robespierre. Robespierre himself was beheaded by an odd coalition of radicals who thought he hadn't gone far enough, and some of the moderates who didn't get purged, and they got together and they sacked him, and off with his head. Couldn't have happened to a nicer guy. Now, when Napoleon came to power, he compromised with the Pope, and he was not fanatically anti-Christian the way the revolution had been. Plus, a majority of the French people were still Roman Catholic. And he gave back most of the church properties that the revolutionaries had seized, but he did not allow the clergy to have any political power, which was probably wise. He conquered and abolished, when he started going to war outside of France, he conquered the Holy Roman Empire, and he abolished it. But he also compromised with them. He said, look, if you renounce the title Holy Roman Emperor, we'll let you reorganize, and you can still be in charge. So he left the Habsburgs in charge of a newly reorganized dual monarchy of Austria-Hungary, which would last until the end of World War I and would be actually instrumental in causing World War I later. But that was a different story. So even the Habsburgs get to stay where they are with Napoleon, as long as they don't try to do the whole I'm the Holy Roman Emperor thing. Now, the French were so relieved by the restoration of order, they had very little to say when Napoleon declared himself Emperor of France. Now, we saw science's initial resistance to the Enlightenment, materialistic rationalism, and we now saw Romanticism's rapid political descent into dictatorship, bloodbath, and terror. We now turn to the Enlightenment's effect on Christian theology. Interestingly, there were a small group of Catholics and another of Protestants who both responded to the impersonal God presented by materialistic deism, by emphasizing that individuals can have a personal relationship with a personal God. That is, a God who is a person. We can have a personal relationship. The Catholic Jansenists emphasized the reality of original sin, human depravity, predestination, the necessity of divine grace for personal salvation. Wait a minute, these are Catholics? Yeah, the Jansenists, they kind of followed Augustine's views and came to many of the same conclusions. The Protestant Pietists, their emphasis on Bible study and sola scriptura, of course, led to similar conclusions. And these guys were independent of each other. They just, to whatever degree they felt they could, went back to the Word and came to those places. Blaise Pascal was a brilliant mathematician, scientist, and he was a Catholic Jansenist. And he's well known for Pascal's wager. Pascal's wager is this: if the Christian God does not exist, the agnostic loses little by believing in him and gains correspondingly little by not believing. If the Christian God does exist, the agnostic gains eternal life by believing in him and loses an infinite good by not believing. Now, this was not an argument for the existence of the Christian God. Rather, it is one that describes the situation we face if the Christian God exists and is who the Bible and the Catholic Church says he is. Now remember, our problems with Roman Catholicism isn't on the view of God. We both believe in the Trinity. The problem is on the question of how does an individual get saved, So both the Catholic Church and the Bible are saying the same thing as to who God is on this level. Now, the Pietists were an organic movement that arose among both Lutherans and Calvinists in continental Europe around Huguenot-style home Bible studies. The Moravian Brethren, led by Count Zinzendorf, was a Pietist community that became a model for modern missionary movements for the next 200 years, from circa 1720 to the turn of the 20th century. Now, the Moravians were known for their burden for the lost. And some actually sold themselves into slavery in the Ottoman Empire to reach the Muslim world with the gospel. Now, Zinzendorf himself traveled to North America and preached to the Iroquois tribes, just before the beginning of the Great Awakening. The Count also warned against the Puritan, Calvinist, and Lutheran tendency sometimes to confuse the acceptance of the gospel with the embracing of European culture. Two different things. Zinzendorf was almost 300 years ahead of his time in his recognition that Christianity does not need help from Western culture to hold up the gospel. Indeed, it was the gospel was part of the foundation that held up and influenced whatever good aspects there are of Western culture, the gospel, not Christendom in either its Catholic or Protestant forms. Now, Zinzendorf's convictions would have allowed the Iroquois to be Iroquois, just like the English were still English and the Germans were still Germans. Now, he believed that the gospel would penetrate Iroquois culture and transform it where necessary, just as it had transformed the Germanic barbarian tribes that were Zinzendorf's own ancestors. And he felt that let the Holy Spirit decide. Don't try to impose Western culture on them. Just give them the gospel. Let it transform. Smart guy. The American Great Awakenings and the Wesleyan revivals owe a lot to the Moravians. Unfortunately, many of the mission movements of the 18th, 19th, and early 20th centuries would not emulate this particular aspect of Zinzendorf's ministry. They would continue to confuse Western culture with Christianity. And so would everybody else because of it. Now, this failure would add to the outrageous treatment of both Native Americans and blacks, of course, and it would greatly contribute to the loss of many of the 18th and 19th century missionary gains during the 20th century. Emulating Zinzendorf would have been costly, but not nearly as costly as the eventual death of Western civilization. A major practical contrast needs to be made between Enlightenment secularists and biblical Christians. Okay, there were lots of Enlightenment secularists who hated slavery, okay? And there were biblical Christians who compromised or even indulged it, okay? But if you compare their ideas, whenever Christians compromised with those who sold and owned slaves or owned slaves themselves, or helped strip Native Americans of their land and their culture, they were being inconsistent with a Judeo-Christian view of human dignity. They were being inconsistent with their own belief system. That was not how the Holy Spirit had led the evangelist monks of the mid to late first millennium. You know, that time period where we used to think of as being, oh yeah, it was very corrupt in those days. Yeah, well, it was. But the Holy Spirit led these evangelist monks to reach the Germanic tribe, animist tribes where they were. He approached them and dealt with them where they were. He didn't make them stop being Germanic. He added something. He didn't take away something. Now, once we have the gospel and we have Christ in our lives, every worldview, it doesn't matter where you come from, doesn't matter who you are, there's always stuff that needs to go. All cultures have bad stuff. All cultures have stuff that can be redeemed. That's true of everybody. Zinzendorf said, you got to let the Holy Spirit do that, though. He's the only one who has the wisdom to do that. So we got to stick to sharing the gospel with them. And that was how his own ancestors were won. When Enlightenment materialists, however, did these things, they were acting consistently with their own assumptions. There was nothing in their belief system in itself that would sound any ethical alarms if they practiced slavery or such. But when Christians failed, their own belief system exposed them. That's something that's good. Hypocrites, tyrants, fanatics, flakes, they exist in every large ethnic, social, or religious people group. So do responsible people who will try to do what's right as best they understand it. White Christians today, those of us with a truly biblical view of humanity, that is, need not feel guilty for the sins of our ancestors. We are not guilty simply because of our skin color or our descent. We should, however, feel shame at what our ancestors did and express it when appropriate, not none of this pandering white guilt nonsense, but when appropriate, be honest, express it. There is a shame there. This isn't woke ideology. It's simple human decency, and it's a deep regret that it happened on a Christian culture's watch that had called the Bible its guide, an earlier stage of our Christian culture. I think, there is some shame there to be had. Okay? I'm not saying we have to go, but we do need to be realistic. We're dealing with people. And there is a big difference between guilt and shame. Guilt is the real moral wrong that we have done to others personally, not the real moral guilt of our ancestors over atrocities that happened many generations before we were born. I mean, how far back do you go? Shame, on the other hand, is a feeling that may or may not stem from real moral guilt. Shame can be placed on others, but people who are not truly guilty of something, simply by treating them as if they are guilty or singling them out for ridicule in some sort of systematic and continual way. So you see, shame and guilt are not the same thing. Now, these definitions are biblical, and the application that I'm talking about here is applicable in the present day. and how we should conduct our relationships based on our history, our real history, not rewritten history. And we can see it modeled for us in Nehemiah chapter 9. In verse 2, it says, the seed of Israel. Now remember, they've come back from the Babylonian captivity, and now they're being taught the word of God by Ezra. And it says, the seed of Israel separated themselves from all strangers and stood and confessed their sins and the sins of their fathers. So this is on an occasion. They're separating themselves, and they're standing, they're confessing their sins and the sins of their fathers. Notice the distinction is made between their personal sins and those of their ancestors. But there is still a shame that has to be dealt with by confession of the ancestral sin before strangers, because sin has unfolding long-term consequences in the real world, and those long-term consequences don't go away. And so you don't always get to just say, well, we did it that one time, isn't that enough? No, there's a dynamic going on, an attitude, I should say, that we should have. And this is based on Deuteronomy 24:16. The fathers shall not be put to death for the sons, neither shall the sons be put to death for the fathers. Every man shall be put to death for his own sin. Now, it is unjust to punish descendants for what their fathers did, especially if significant, even if imperfect, progress is made in putting away the sin of their fathers. Now, I think everybody should keep in mind that 2.7 million white people did go to war, sometimes even against their own families, and shed their own blood, with over 300,000 casualties to end black slavery. I'm not saying that's payment in full or anything. No, that was the result of our own foolishness, okay? But nevertheless, you wouldn't get an end to slavery without that sort of thing. It came down to that. It's a process, in other words. Had the mission movements of the 18th through 20th century embraced Zinzendorf's practices about ethnicity and evangelism more often, injustices to Native Americans likely would have been either prevented or greatly minimized, and never would have become entrenched, or at least it would have significantly lessened the injustices. This whole thing has proved to be the ugliest, most costly hypocrisy in all of Christian history, because it was brought about through the auspices of Reformation-based Christians at a time when they were also thinking to exalt the Bible. And we're going to see next week that, there were some Christians involved in this. Now, this is especially scandalous because the most coherent argument against racism is based in the historical reality of the events in Genesis chapters 1 through 11. Now, these opening chapters of the Bible show that all humanity is descended from the same parents, of the same blood, that we are all sinners in need of lawful restraint in God's grace. Unfortunately, Jansenism and Pietism were not the only theological responses to Enlightenment materialism. Many of the institutional churches reacted to the rise of materialistic philosophies by accommodating them. The Jansenists and Pietists had a powerful faith, but there were too few to prevent the fall of Reformation-based institutional churches to radically anti-Christian philosophies and theologies like Romanticism and deism. If German theological schools often just rolled over, the German theological schools often just rolled over and embraced the new Enlightenment thinking without questioning its assumptions. Do you see the falling dominoes here? German philosopher Immanuel Kant had elements of Hume's empiricism and Voltaire's rationalism, and mixed these with his own sort of semi-Christian ethics, although his were polluted by a kind of deep-seated racism. And he became a forerunner of liberal theology. Immanuel Kant, epistemological attorney. I saw this cartoonist Fred Van Lente and Ryan Dunleavy. Really, really funny. You got Kant there at his desk. Well, you did the smart thing by coming to me, Mr. God. I saw your ad on a bench. These cases are the specialty of action philosopher number 22, Immanuel Kant, epistemological attorney. Anyway, hilarious. You should look him up. Kant was all about trying to salvage Christian morality. See, everybody's seeing where things are going, but they don't really have a moral system. So they're trying to salvage Christian morality and plaster it on top of this new edifice they're building, philosophical edifice. And basically they're reasoning, even if Christianity is wrong about everything else, its moral system is tried and proven to reflect common sense in the big picture. So we should probably keep it, eh, guys? It was with the ideas of Kant that the Western worldview began to fracture into a kind of split view of reality, where meaning, morality, and values had originally, the whole world had been seen as one unified existence. The external world, the internal world of thought, spirit, mind, matter was all seen as one reality. Now, it's starting to fracture. The imaginary mental world of information, morality, and spirit is on this upper realm and on this lower realm, and there's no connection between them, and the gap is going to get wider and wider. The external world of the material, or the real world of matter and energy. This is the beginning of the split. Materialist faith assumptions had also led to a need to find a place for God in the system. Well, why? Because materialism doesn't allow for these things. Hello? But they're still going to pretend that they can just sort of, they're still going to pretend that they can, mulch this together here. Now, in later episodes, we're going to flesh out what ended up on each side of the fracture line as the new Western worldview develops. Now, at the beginning of this episode, we saw how each worldview needed its own cosmology, its own myth or theory of origins to reflect its underlying faith assumptions. We see in the tension between materialistic rationalism and Romanticism a clash between the intellect and the emotions. Though Romanticism seems like a rebellion against rationalism, the two actually developed a symbiotic relationship to one another. They worked together. Romanticism led to a vague form of pantheism, the idea that all of nature together equals an impersonal God, or God equals nature. So Romanticism leads things in that direction. And of course, we have that great moral philosopher Mikhail Gorbachev, who said he was the last Soviet party secretary there. He was the guy who had that birthmark that looked like a giant red map of the Korean peninsula on his forehead. To me, nature is sacred. Trees are my temples and forests my cathedrals. Okay, thank you, Gorbo. Quit hogging the ball. Okay, so Romanticism fed into the new cosmology along with rationalism. This pantheism was naturalistic enough not to bother the hard rationalists and gave a placebo for spirituality to satisfy the romanticists, as long as they didn't look too closely. Nobody better look too closely. And they didn't. Pantheism. And our old friend Carl Sagan again said, a religion, old or new, that stressed the magnificence of the universe as revealed by modern science might be able to draw forth reserves of reverence and awe hardly tapped by conventional faiths. Sooner or later, such a religion will emerge. Yeah, it's called Star Wars, Carl. Go worship the Force, The The cosmos is all that there is or all there ever will be. Few noticed that there was a distinction between science, that is a method for studying the natural world, and scientism, which is an ideological and religious hope that science was the ultimate method for knowing everything and would solve all of humanity's problems. The two are not the same, but people in large numbers either downplay this distinction or more often they don't even notice it. The degree to which this ideology used scientism to create its own new cosmology is revealed by a statement made by Professor Stephen Hawking. However, no, I'm not going to do that. That would just be too painful. However, we're not able to make cosmological models without some admixture of ideology. In the earliest cosmologies, man placed himself in a commanding position at the center of the universe. Since the time of Copernicus, we have been steadily demoted to a medium-sized planet around a medium-sized star on the outer edge of a fairly average galaxy, which is itself simply one of a local group of galaxies. Indeed, we are now so democratic that we would not claim our position in space is distinguished in any way. He wrote that in a large-scale structure of space-time. Now, real quick, both the medieval Christian and Enlightenment worldviews went to extremes and are still going to extremes to seek in nature a defense for their moral systems. In medieval absolute Aristotle, the medieval world sought in nature signs to confirm an absolute divine moral order. They assumed that they grasped nature's purpose or teleology a whole lot more than they really did. They didn't know how big God and God's cosmos really was. Okay, nobody does. They feared that if the cosmological order didn't perfectly match the social one, that somehow Christian society would unravel. That was part of what the whole we saw the whole Galileo controversy. Some of that was feeding into it. And they forgot that a cursed cosmos rarely has perfect matches. Now we're dealing today with modern absolute Copernicus. Seeks in nature's signs to confirm random cosmos, where humanity has no special place, having no real meaning or purpose, no teleology. Likewise, nobody knows how big God is or God's cosmos really is. And today they really hysterically fear that if evidence of design is taken seriously, then pluralistic secular society will collapse. Forgets that ideology skews objectivity just as dogma does. And we are seeing evidence, growing evidence, for design in the cosmos. Even that it is just as erroneous to make Copernicus into the cosmological absolute as it was to make Aristotle into one. That we are, after all, in a special place on the galactic cluster size scale. This is a telemetry photograph of distant webs of galaxy clusters, and they're in layers. The nearer ones have been assigned a color by the computer, a kind of a goldish color. The farther ones are more purple. That's not their natural light, but you can see there's a very distinct gradation. There's not just a smear of color. You have the very orangey golden, and then you have the very purple. And if you look real carefully in the back, you can see even further ones. This is a physicist, Russell Humphreys. He's a friend of mine. And he wrote concerning redshifts. Now, all distant light is redshifted, okay, because the sources are moving away from us, all right? And that stretches the light waves out. And so that's why we're talking about redshifts. Astronomers have confirmed that numerical values of galaxy redshifts, that is the places where these galaxy cluster webs appear, are quantized. They tend to fall into distinct groups. In other words, they're not gradually homogenized, smeared. No, there's some here, and then there's a distance, and then there's some more, and then there's a distance. They're at quantized distances. And this would mean that the galaxies tend to be grouped into conceptual spherical shells concentric around our home galaxy. Now, what the Big Bang predicted was that there would be a gradualistic move from nearer to farther away, that there would just be a gradualistic smear, that all space was homogenized, it was all pretty much the same everywhere. But what we're seeing are these quantized concentric spheres of webs. And the upshot is that the galaxy distances spaced in quantized redshift shells would only be visible if we were somewhere near the center of a finite universe on a galactic cluster size scale. In other words, if you were to move our galaxy off and throw it out into the middle of this whole spherical thing, you wouldn't be able to see that you were in concentric spheres unless you were somewhere near the center. Now, very good book, and he's updated it since it first came out, Starlight in Time. He's a Christian. He's a young Earth creationist Christian even. He's written a cosmology, done some very good work on it. It's ongoing. Anyway, we can get that book for you at the bookstore. We currently do not have any. Anyway, next week, the Wesleyan Revivals and the First Great Awakening, Reason, Revolution, and Renewal, Part 4. God bless. Read chapter 19.